So this book is about how globalization is affecting national politics and the education of indigenous citizens. And the framework for the book is that unprecedented changes in international law leading to the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People in 2007 provide the context for this study. As of today, 9 countries in Latin America have reformed their constitutions to guarantee the constitutional right to intercultural bilingual education. And I call it in Spanish, Educación Intercultural y Bilingüe, so I'm going to use the AID as well. And in the other countries, even though there is not a constitutional right, there are regulations within the ministries of education that give indigenous people the right to the education in their own languages and cultures. So I wanted to talk a little bit about the statistics about indigenous people in Latin America. These are the 5 countries that we talk about in the book. These are very different countries. The country, as you can see, that has the largest percentage of indigenous people is Bolivia, and it has approximately 60% of the people in Bolivia are indigenous. Then we have the next country that has a greater percentage of indigenous is Guatemala, with almost 40%. And then we have Ecuador, Mexico, and Peru that are around 10%. Now, each of these countries have very different educational systems in which they educate indigenous people. In Bolivia, in 2010, they created a new education law that has really advanced the education all at the legal level. So Bolivia today has a very advanced system, and in Mexico is the one that has the largest system of education for indigenous people. Today, there are more than 1 million indigenous children in indigenous schools in Mexico. In Guatemala, there is also an effort to improve indigenous and rural education. Peru is more different because there is a lot more indigenous education in the Amazonian region with the Aymaras. They are much more organized than in the Highlands where the Quechua speakers are. So there is a very big difference in Peru between the Amazonian area and the Highlands where the Quechua people live. So this is just to give you an example. So all the chapters in the book relate to these 5 countries that are the countries in Latin America that have the highest population of indigenous population. But all over Latin America, we have seen a tremendous resurgence of indigenous identity. So in Chile, in Argentina, in Uruguay, there is a lot of mobilization of indigenous people. They want their language recognized, they want their language taught in school. So this is a phenomenon that is affecting the whole region. And so the purpose of Educación Intercultural Bilingüe is inclusive, is to include the culture, the ethnicity, and the linguistic diversity. So when the constitutions were changed, the change was to say that these countries were no longer Spanish speaking. So they said they are countries that represent multiple languages, multiple identities, and more than one ethnicity. So I want to say that it is from a human rights perspective that all this, Educación Intercultural Bilingüe has been developed, and it's really a political project to improve the cultural and linguistic autonomy of indigenous people. And so I would like to say that the essence of intercultural bilingual education is both political and pedagogical. And as you see, I put political first. Its aim is to resolve the conflict between the national culture that had been always assimilationist, that wanted to make all the people only speak Spanish, and indigenous people for a reconstruction of a national society so that they are more inclusive of diversity. So that's the hope, to have a more diverse national culture. But so I want to talk a little bit about how I frame the study and how I got interested in this thing of the European aid to education in Latin America. This has been a topic of my research now for many years. And so the Europeans have provided a lot of aid to Latin America, mostly Spain before its economic crisis, and Germany. Germany has been a constant presence in education in Latin America, and it has been always in alliance with the indigenous people and the civil movements. So it's an engagement of the civil society, because the German government, the German corporation, in alliance with the civil society, pressure the states to change the regulations and to change the laws. And I also talk about what I call transnational intellectual networks that have been very important in supporting indigenous movements. Because indigenous movements by themselves inside the national state, they don't have a lot of power, but it's these transnational intellectual networks that have really empowered the indigenous movement within the national societies to change. And when I talk about transnational intellectual networks, I want to talk about the NGOs, but I also want to say that it's very important to talk about the social scientists. There are linguists, they are anthropologists, there are social scientists in Europe, in the United States, in Latin America that are really committed to create new knowledge about how to improve the education of indigenous people. And without these transnational networks, it would be very little to have been achieved. So when I started studying this issue of bilateral aid, that means it's an aid that goes from one country to another country. It's not aid that goes through the like through the United Nations. One of the things is that a lot of the literature that is written about bilateral aid is very interesting. Most of the books are in the business schools. They are not here because what people are studying is the transfer of cash. How much cash is being transferred from Europe to Peru or from the United States to Latin America. And really what I'm trying to figure out is how that aid has helped. And I'm not so much interested in the money, but in the impact of that aid in education. So my focus is really education, and not so much the flow from the donors to the south, or how this donors' money is affecting how countries vote in the United Nations, and the type of studies that there are on this topic. A lot of the research we do in comparative and international education is focused on best practices of how USAID goes to another country and tries to develop what works in the United States or in another country and say, oh, the solution for preschool education is to do exactly what we're doing in the United States. And so here I'm talking about something that is a very different donor logic, because there is no best practice. As I always say, there is no bilingual education for Turkish in German schools. But then Germany has been the largest supporter of bilingual education in most of Latin American countries. And also because it has been such a sustained contribution for many years that has created what I call the academic field of intercultural bilingual education. And there are studies, as I said, both in Europe and the United States and Latin America that is trying to really support this practice. So the idea is the European Union is very committed to create better quality education for the poor. And really this is really to help Latin America and other countries, say Africa or other countries, that over the last decades we haven't seen any improvement in the quality of education for the poor, but what we have seen in most regions is an increased educational inequality, because there has not been any real policy to improve equity in education. So, and I'm going to talk about Germany because that's what I was studying myself, and that's what my chapter in the book is about. And I was studying the GIC, that is the German Cooperation Agency, and their focus has been two things: professional development of teachers and development of new curriculum and teacher materials. But one thing that had really lagged behind, and it's very clear now that have become like a stop to the continued development of intercultural bilingual education, is that we don't have enough teachers that are trained in their native language, or that they themselves know how to write their native language, their native indigenous language, to be able to teach it. So as long we don't have teachers trained to do that, it's very difficult to create quality education. It's the same thing that we see in the United States. A lot of the problems with dual language education or bilingual education is that the teachers are not as strong in their second language that they need to teach as they are in the dominant language. So we see the same kind of problem. So one of the things that Germany has done, and that I describe in my article and my book, is that they have contributed to the knowledge creation, that is to the academic field of intercultural bilingual education, that have a long-term vision of change. I don't think, I'm going to give a project run tomorrow and it's going to immediately happen. They have been supporting this for 30 years or more. And so I'm going to talk about those two projects very shortly, the one in Peru and the one in Bolivia. And now those two projects have closed. So now they have been supporting what is called the Latin American Indigenous University. That is a network of universities in which indigenous people have access to indigenous knowledge in different countries of Latin America, and the project in Guatemala, that is a project for professional development of teachers. So the only 2, 3, and 4 are working today. The others have been closed, and I want to give you a little bit of this project in Proeduca. This is the program for education in Peru, and it was closed in 2007, and that was really got me interested in finding out why a project that had been so successful suddenly closed. And the second is a project in Bolivia. It's called the Proib Andes. So I went and interviewed. I was there and interviewed the people that had worked for the German corporation while they were there. And so the idea was very simple. The idea that they had is that in order for Peru to improve their education in the Highlands, they have to start by teaching the teachers of the future teachers in the Institutos Pedagógicos. So they felt that if they had better trained teachers for the teachers in the normal schools, that then that was a way to impact rural education in Peru. And so the idea was to really teach to the faculty, those institutes, how to teach about intercultural bilingual education, and also to have a more participatory education rather than just a top-down, like the teachers give the students what they know. So that it was a really a community mobilization that affected all those institutes in the Andean region. And so it was a project that involved the Ministry of Education, the regional governments, and the Institutos Pedagógicos Superiores. And I just want to show you this timeline because it's interesting that Germany started working in Peru in the 1970s. That Peru was the first country in Latin America that had Quechua as an indigenous language as an official language, and that was Quechua. So ever since then, it has been working closely together with the government in Peru to try to improve the indigenous and rural education. And in 2007, they closed the project, closed their educational office, and left. And And that was the thing that I was interested in, why they suddenly leave. And so the idea of the project was to develop, the ability of interculturality and bilingualism in teachers, and also to have to give to the teachers a sense that that education was a process of democratization, not only a top-down process. And it was also important to start to recognize multiculturality versus multiculturalism, to try to put both the indigenous cultures and the national mestizo cultures at the same level. So it was a huge process of change, and it was all connected with the idea that Toledo had when he was president to really break the central system in Peru and empower the regions. So this started when Toledo was president of Peru, and that's when they signed the agreements. Then later on, when the next president of Peru came, he said, well, to show the diversity of Peruvian society is not going to help economic investment. And so Alan Garcia stopped the whole process of decentralization of Peru and really centralized again. And really what happened was that the possibility that the German project has to really increase the voice at the local level and create more community leadership was really stopped. So that's when Germany decided to stop the project in Peru, and they left and really close everything. So even though they closed before time, there was, when you talk to the people that were in the regions while the Germans were there, there was a lot of new resources that went into the regions, and people felt that it included the managerial and leadership capacities in the schools, and a lot of the teachers that were trained became leaders in the regions and had positions in the municipal governments and in the regional presidency. So it was a change that was coming from the bottom up to try to change the schools, to change the society, and really give more voice to the indigenous people in the highlands of Peru. The project in Bolivia also closed for another reason, and the project in Bolivia was very different. The project in Bolivia is called Bilingual Andes, that is in the Universidad in San Simón in Cochabamba, and it has been a project that really helped to educate 200 indigenous leaders all over the region. All of the indigenous leaders that today are talking about indigenous education, most of them came from these Bilingual Andes. But so Germany said we're going to fund it up to that date, and then the countries have to pick it up. So, but what happened is that the impact of the German closing its support, it also affected the other Latin American countries, because without Germany saying, okay, I give so much money, then the other countries stop giving fellowship to the students to go to the Bilingual Andes. So what happened is now the Bilingual Andes still is influential, but it's just, it's in under public university in Cochabamba, and has lost a lot of the influence that it used to have in educating indigenous leaders. So I just want to say, and I can talk more about each of the chapters later, I think one of the issues that is very important in this research is that without doubt there has been a great improvement or moving forward in recognizing the ethnic, cultural, and linguistic diversity, and there is more support for the training of teachers and administrators, but still the government has not done its part. When they sign the agreement, they say, oh yes, we're going to continue developing the project, but that has not happening in many cases. I wanted just to use this quote from Luis Enrique that if the indigenous people are not really involved in these decisions, then when they want to change their schools, they feel like that is a paternalistic attitude of the state that wants to come change the schools. So in a lot of places in Bolivia, they see educación intercultural y bilingual as a neoliberal policy. You know, the state was trying to show that they were really trying to help the indigenous people without really doing anything. So, because there was not really a buyout of the indigenous movement when these policies were started. Now with the new law, let's see what happens. But the last census of Bolivia is interesting that it shows a decrease of people that identify themselves as indigenous. So I think the investment now of the international, I mean the European donors, is more towards the universities than towards the teacher training institutions. I think when you get into teacher training institutions, you get very close to state policy, union power inside those countries. So it's a much more difficult process of change. I think the universities is seen like an area where there is much more autonomy and easier to provide change than within the teacher training institutions. And as I say here, that the alliance between the indigenous movements and the European aid is not enough, because if the government is not going to continue to support what they start doing, then once the aid finished, the progress is stalled. So, you know, even though the Germans are not in Bolivia and in Peru anymore, they left tremendous amount of resources that are being used by other agencies now. They did curriculum, they did teacher guides, tremendous amount of resources. And so now they are working in these Latin American university, as I said, where they are giving master's degrees. So they are moving away from both Bolivia and Peru. So what is interesting about this research and all the chapters in the book is the type of policy implementations that took place in each country. So one case is Mexico, where intercultural bilingual education has been really driven by the state. The state is the one that has funded the intercultural universities. One of the findings that I found very interesting is that today there are more indigenous people speaking indigenous languages in Mexico than in their parent generation. And in these indigenous intercultural universities, indigenous students can come in with their languages and their identities. They don't have to show themselves as assimilated in order to go to higher education. In the other case would be, and I think now in Bolivia, since the reform of 2010, you can talk about that is a state-driven reform. In the case of Guatemala, clearly it has been donor-driven, and if the donors were not there, who knows what will happen to the changes that are taking place in Guatemala right now. And the Latin American university, indigenous university, is totally donor-driven. There are 29 Latin American countries, there are 29 countries, 20 Latin American countries, and 3 European countries. Is Belgium, Spain, and Germany that is providing most of the support for that university. And one of the, as I said, divergent points of view that come out in the chapters in the book is that some people want to say that in Bolivia there is bottom-up mobilization, that it really came from the bottom up. But I really think that it's more a case of a state-driven reform. And we can talk about that. And so just I think the importance of this research is that it really represents the first effort in the regional level to provide quality education for indigenous children. Even though the right to quality education is a constitutional right in many countries, the fact that the teachers are not being trained in the multiple languages of the region makes this reform to stop, because the quality education cannot be given. And as I said earlier, you know, many teachers still today are not able to write in their own indigenous language, so that makes it very difficult for them to teach their own indigenous language. And I think that's all I have for now, and I'll be open to questions for maybe first.
The book quite significant. I mean, significant worldwide, because this is a phenomenon, the connection between education, language, and identity, and collective identity is a global phenomenon. It exists everywhere. It is particularly interesting for Latin America in a negative way. That is, if there is a region where this conflict between education, language, and identity is least divisive, is actually Latin America. Latin America is an interesting place. Like the Americas in general, is the most multiracial region in the world. Actually, this is the only regions in the world where we define people by colors. Black and white and browns and pardos and yellows and red skin, and that's actually quite rare elsewhere in the world. It's more common now because of these global movements of people that Europe is multiracial today. But Europe 20, 30 years ago, it was not particularly multiracial. I remember going to Europe and coming back and being amazed at seeing black people at JFK. That I don't have that anymore, but that's a very recent phenomenon. Or coming from Dubai, as I came yesterday, and seeing people of all different colors in Dubai. But again, that was a very rare phenomenon outside of the Americas. The point is that in the Americas, ethnicity, there is two definitions of ethnicity. One is the ethno-linguistic differences between neighboring people. The Aymara, the Quechua, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Mixtec, right? Which is the norm everywhere in the world. That is how ethnicity is defined everywhere in the world. But we have another form, which is not the difference between ethno-linguistic difference between neighboring people, adjacent people, but between people who came from different corners of the planet, and therefore they're physically different, right? Neighboring people can look alike. People who come from different corners of the earth, they can look quite differently phenotypically, right? So we have this tendency to racialize ethnicity. But even though Latin America and the Americans in general are the most multiracial places in the world, they're the least multicultural regions in the world. We talk about cultural diversity and multiculturalism in the United States, in Latin America. Yes, in intrinsic terms, yes, every place is multicultural, multi-whatever. But in comparison to just about any place in the world, what is striking about Latin America and also the United States and Canada is how homogeneous culturally these places are. Once I did a study of linguistic, something that is critical for the book, language. In all of the Americas, there are 7 languages spoken by more than 500,000 people. 7 languages. In Ghana alone, there are 12. In the Philippines, 17. In Ethiopia, 24. In the island of Borneo alone, 20-something. In India, I stopped counting. I only counted the ones that started with the letter K, and they were 30, and I stopped counting, right? So what is striking actually is the lack of cultural and linguistic diversity in the Americas. There are fewer languages than anywhere else. There is actually even fewer Creole languages. That's actually quite interesting. There is only a single Creole of Spanish in Latin America, Palenquero, spoken by 200 people south of Cartagena. It's a mixture of Spanish and Bantu. And there is no Portuguese Creole in the Americas. but there are 21 Portuguese Creoles in Asia and Africa. So there is something about the Americas that, you know, cultural diversity doesn't come with us. The proportion of the population that speaks colonial language, the colonial language in Latin America is huge. I mean, when you saw the figures there, even in indigenous countries, the majority of the population speak the language of the colonizers. Compared to just about who speaks English in India as a first language, about 1/10 of 1% of the population. I mean, even in Kazakhstan, in the ex-Russian Empire, even in North Africa, where the Arabs have been there for 9 centuries. You know, it's not a question of that the Portuguese and the Spaniards were there for 3 centuries. The Arabs colonizing in North Africa have been there for what? 14 centuries. And there is still 40% of the population in Morocco and Nigeria that speak Berber, the indigenous language, compared to what the figures that you were giving there. Not even in Guatemala, where, you know, I mean, and again in Guatemala, in Peru, we're talking about places where, in terms of biological ancestry, 95% of the population is indigenous, of indigenous ancestry. So these things, these proportions of the indigenous that Regina was showing is a cultural definition of ethnicity. It's not a racial ancestry definition of ethnicity. So this is quite intriguing, and I think this one of the many merits of this book is that it studies this nexus between global actors and local actors at different levels. You saw about all of these, the emphasis on European NGOs, the German NGOs, but also, as she mentioned, European states, the German government. So I don't know if the Spanish government also you mentioned. Then networks of scholars and intellectuals, what you call intellectual networks, that more than intellectual, they're academic, really, when you come to think about it. Most of these people that are participating in this have an academic association. It's not just an intelligentsia, right? It's an institutional networks. This bilateral agreement, so it's globalized, but at the same time, many of these things that you're examining are bilateral, as you rightly point out, right? Then how this begins to undermine the traditional discourses, public discourses and narratives about nationality and national membership, which were an idea of mestizaje and hybridity, that these Latin American countries were a hybrid, mestizo people, and that was the national identity. That there was no space for diversity within that. We are a result of meldings of many different people, but after that result is there, we are a mestizo nation. And then all of this is undermining that notion of a nation as a unicultural mestizo nation. All of this, that the rise of indigenous people, that is interesting. A lot of this, both politically and intellectually, emerged and became quite powerful in places where these indigenous people, or first people, or First Nations, or whatever we want to call them, were a small minority of the population. It's actually quite interesting. In Canada, what proportion of Canadians are First people? I don't know, 2–3%. In the United States, what proportion of Americans are Native Americans? Half of 1%. In Australia, it's big. Rather than in places like Guatemala or Bolivia. And then also the connections. This is something that the book truly goes beyond simply the idea of identity, but also about identity, the acceptance of multiculturality or pluriculturality, and also civic democracy. So it's more than simply a question of identity, what you are exploring. Then exploring this difficult thing, particularly difficult in Latin America, you refer to it indirectly, But it's this question of interculturality. In Latin America, sometimes it's seen as an import, as something that did not emerge autochthonally from indigenous people of Latin America, but that this is some fact that Germans, Belgians, Spaniards, and North Americans are now into, and that we are copying and mimicking that fact the same way that used to copy, I don't know, McDonald's. And so almost like if it was the postmodern form of cultural imperialism. And you know, you address all of that debate going on. There is no consensus really. I mean, you alluded to it, but the other thing, there was not much mentioned in the book about that sporadically, but the connection of another element of globalization, which is mobility, migration, right? There is a lot of, in Latin America, there was a long tradition of indigenous neighborhoods in La Paz, Aymara neighborhoods, or Quechua neighborhoods, or Lima, and they were very similar to, I don't know, Little Italies or Little Pueblas. Little Puebla now is what it used to be the Puerto Rican Harlem, the East or Spanish Harlem, which is actually interesting. It's Little Puebla, it's a Mexican state, but it could be Little Mixteca, because most of those Pueblans, maybe Puebla because they're from the state of Puebla, but they're also indigenous people speaking they're mostly from the Alta Mixteca Alta. So both within Latin America, right, and then transnationally, all of these enclaves of indigenous people, the proportion of people speaking a Native American language in the United States has been increasing tremendously in the last 20 years. And it is not because Native Americans are multiplying more than usual. It is because of the majority of Native Americans today are actually people from south of the border and their descendants. And that some of them are actually getting a strong ethnic indigenous identity. The other thing that I like about the book is this constant analysis of the interplay between, I mean, you call it the bottom up, but it's an interplay between the bottom and the top. What is top down and what is bottom up, right? That is the role of the state, as you said in the case of Mexico, the role of NGOs, but also the role of teachers, and something interesting, even when it's coming from the top, how it plays, and this is what is bottom up, right? That even when it's a state instituted, you guys analyze how it's playing out on the ground level, you know. That is actually quite interesting in terms of institutional practices, community practices, grassroots. It's not simply state policy. Well, there is also this question of rural, that you address at the end, that most of these schools are rural. Do they have a chance of becoming also urban? You know, that's a question of gender. And in general, is the possibility, and this is what is global, the possibility of having pluricultural or intercultural spaces in nation states that demand often, adherence to a single culture. And in this case, the lessons that you're drawing or the insights that you're drawing can be applicable to, I don't know, Spain with Basque and Catalans, or Belgium with the Flemish and Walloon speakers, right? So this is going on in a lot of places. The circumstances change. In the case of Spain, the linguistic minorities, Basque and Catalans, are also the privileged and the most powerful. They're minority in the sense that they're minority demographically, but not a minority sociologically. They're not underprivileged, they're hyper-privileged. But also the possibilities of not only diversity, but diversity with equity. And that's something that you keep on hammering, issues of pedagogical practices. And the questions that I had were basically two. One was how interculturality is. Because it seems that in this inter is one way. That is, that indigenous people will learn their own languages and learn Spanish, right? but not the other way around, right? It doesn't seem that any Spanish speaker, mestizos, or people of European ancestry seem to be learning. So it's inter only in one direction. And the other thing was the interaction between, or the connection between a language and identity. Actually, the country where the highest proportion of the population speaks an indigenous language was not only Tebu. It is actually Paraguay, with not Aymara, Kupi, Guarani, right? It's like 70% of the population speak Guarani. But it's language without identity. It's not that they say, I'm Guarani. They speak Guarani, and a lot of mestizos speak Guarani, but it doesn't go with an identity. And that's a phenomenon, you know, the possibility that you speak a language, but you don't identify as a member of, that would be an interesting question for you to explore. Yeah.
Is that Paraguay is completely different than all the other Latin America?
Yeah.
Because what happened is that all during the Transnational dictatorship, Spanish was the language of the schools. And at the end of the dictatorship, and the Spanish were very involved in that, they helped the war to create an alphabet in Guarani. And then they created two different schools. They created schools, Spanish Guarani for people that were Spanish dominant, and Guarani Spanish for those that were Guarani dominant. Because what happened is that most people orally spoke Guarani, but they didn't know how to write or speak. There was no alphabet then. So the language reform came in a very different way, and that in these other countries that they are mostly Spanish dominant.
Yeah.
So that's why Guarani has been the language of the country, but as you say, there is not an issue of indigenous identity connected to speaking Guarani in Paraguay. There is in other countries.
Yeah. So I thought that was the outlier. So maybe you did right excluding Uruguay, correct?
No,
Paraguay. But no, Paraguay you had zero as a number of indigenous people, zero.
Okay.
In some table.
No, but
whatever. It was a book that raised a lot of interesting stuff with implications not only for Latin America, but just about any place. There are very few places that are monolingual. Switzerland. So it's not only in the third world. So congratulations.
The Germans went to Peru in the 70s, right?
Yes.
So I know that the Sendero Luminoso, the Shining Path guerrilla rebels, were pretty involved in the indigenous communities. Did that affect indigenous education in the Highlands? Is that part of the reason why the Amazon has stronger indigenous education, because there was this kind of constant violent group that was in the Highlands?
Well, I think that one of the issues is that like the message that the people in the Highland have always been receiving is that they are peasants, so they don't see themselves as indigenous. So the resurgence of indigenous identity has been much more delayed in the highlands of Peru than in the Amazon region, but it's because this emphasis on being, they consider themselves peasants and not and I think now that and one of the explanations they give is they have never had very strong indigenous leaders there. And that would be very interesting to find out, and it has to do with how the national state in Peru has always been authoritarian and have not given them any power. And in the Amazonian region, for some reason, they have been more autonomous. One of the things when I was doing this research that really surprised me is that Benavides, that is a professor at the university in in Lima. He wrote for UNICEF a book on indigenous children in Peru. And he said that of the indigenous school in the Highland, only 9% of the schools have water and electricity. So that just tells you the quality of the schools. And you see a big contrast between, and that's an important part, you know, the indigenous children that go to school in Lima, you know, they go to much better schools than the indigenous children that go to school in the Highlands. But the issue in both cases, they haven't been able to really create some strong identity. Like, for example, you know, you can take the extreme case of the Zapatistas in the autonomous region. You know, when there is a strong identity now being taught in the Zapatista, in the autonomous Zapatista schools. When I spoke with indigenous leaders in Peru, it was very different to talk with the Aymara and with the Quichuas. It's something you know.
Also in the Highlands. And what is the difference?
In terms of you know, of how they see their role as connected to the schools and to the preservation of the environment, and talking about how the schools are part of their community. I felt that in the Highlands they feel very oppressed. You know, there is there is no strong indigenous group.
But a lot of indigenous people of the Highlands actually from around Puno or the West South are Aymara.
No, but I'm talking about Cusco and other area there. That's where they were trying to work in that area and put the regions.
Hi, I would like to make my name is Diana Gonzalez. I would like to make a commentary on what Professor
Moya
said about something very interesting. I don't know. I am unfortunately an European, so I didn't know that very interesting commentary this professor made, connecting the fact that there is not a lot of language diversity in Latin America. I had not been aware of that. Interesting. Versus Africa, which I do know. And it occurred
versus Europe. There are more languages probably in the Caucasus alone. Georgian.
Yeah. It occurred to me one explanation maybe, and perhaps I'm wrong, but the result of the fact that Latin America had great empires that unified huge areas, so Incas, the Aztecs, the Mayas, and many other empires very, very early on that kind of organize and pace enormous territories, or you know, in a homogenization, you say, rather than, for example, Africa, where you have, and I know personally a lot of Africans complain about that, a great tribal mentality where is them and 3 other families and friends, and I could see the development of the Pidgin of Portuguese, Pidgin of Spanish, Le Français, Patois, with all the different diversities, versus getting the Spanish handed in by the Spaniards in an inquisitorial manner. I bet we did that. And because that's our style at the moment. And then from there, you know, these areas which were already unified, organized by their own, the Incas, the Mayas, whatever, didn't then become diversified, such as in Africa.
I don't know, it's difficult to say because after all, the Mongol Empire stretched from Manchuria to Hungary, right? So, Songhai Empire in Africa also was huge. Benin Empire was large, right?
Yes.
I don't know, it could be. But definitely the colonization of the Spaniards and the Portuguese helped. But I think another element is that these countries may be in the New World, Latin American countries, but they're some of the oldest countries in the world. They have been around for 2 centuries, and they have been homogenizing So the Hispanization, or the Iberianization of Latin America, part was done by the Portuguese and the Spaniards, but part was done by Creole people of whatever racial ancestry, Hispanized people, right? In the last 2 centuries, and it continues in the highlands of Peru that Professor Cortina was mentioning. You could see how people who are older than 60, the likelihood of them speaking Quechua or Aymara are very high. People who are older than 30, less. People who are under 20, less. So you can see how the Hispanization or the indigenization of these places culturally is something that is going on today. It's not, it's a long process. Yeah?
About the diversity of languages in Latin America, well, Spain had an explicit policy of homogenizing culturally and linguistically the Spanish Empire, beginning by Spain itself, in which the Moors and the Jews were expelled, or if they wanted to stay, they had to convert to Catholicism, and they had to learn Spanish and to adopt the style of life of the Spaniards. And within Spain, the Catalonians and the Galicians and the Basques had to learn Spanish. So there was an imposed policy of homogenization. But on the other hand, I believe that the number of indigenous speakers certainly in Mexico, is highly underestimated, because many times the indigenous people, when they are asked by census takers if they speak an indigenous language, they say no, because they feel that is going to work in their disadvantage, because the racist ideology prevailing racist ideology kind of minorizes the speakers of indigenous languages. But in addition to that, I wanted to ask something else. The indigenous movements in Latin America have been very, very critical of indigenous education. Why? Because indigenous education up to the 1970s, 1980s was defined as an education which had the purpose of acculturating people. So indigenous movements protested against that. But on the other hand, there doesn't seem to be a new proposition of what is indigenous education. It's not for acculturation. But if you teach European style of education to indigenous people, even if you don't force the Spanish language or the Portuguese language, the cultural pressure is towards assuming a style of life in which indigenous languages are not particularly useful. So the reason for Spanish. On the other hand, speaking of the Guarani in Bolivia, in Bolivia, with the new type of state which is being created in Bolivia, you have now that indigenous education, bilingual, intercultural education, is in the hands of the local indigenous movements, the capitanías, or whatever they are called. But the problem is that in this world of globalization, many people are leaving their localities to go to work in the cities. In Bolivia, they are going to La Paz, but not only to La Paz, they are going to Buenos Aires. And in Ecuador, they are going to Spain. and in Mexico they are coming to the United States. So if you have this kind of dilemma, or you have a paradox, that if you educate people to stay in their villages and carry on their local, living in their local cultures, that is not working in favor of improving their condition if they migrate. On the other hand, if you only educate people to live in a westernized world, you are weakening local cultures and languages. So how do you solve how do you call that?
Well, for example, if you take the example of the Mixtecos from Oaxaca in Los Angeles, through their migration, they have really been a resurgence of Mixteco identity, both in Los Angeles and back in Oaxaca. And they have really helped improve the schools. And the idea is not so much that they're just going to teach them Mixteco, but they're teaching them Mixteco plus Spanish. So they continue to have their cultures and also learning Spanish. So,
but probably that doesn't have anything to do with schools, with education.
They do it through schools.
They do it through schools.
The thing that is like,
no, but he was saying the resurgence of ethnic identity about Mixtecos in Los Angeles is not related to education, is it?
It is, because they have their, they have their community schools, and they have also published dictionaries and a lot of stories for the Mixteco children to learn about their past. But it's like their economic empowerment, I think, helped them to increase their indigenous identity. The issue is, I think in certain areas of Mexico, there is an increased use of Nahuatl. Like in the Universidad Intercultural, the one of the state of Mexico, is the one that is the strongest. And they are training a lot of teachers that are able to go and teach Nahuatl in the schools. I think a lot of the work that needs to be done is to educating the parents, because the parents feel like, why I'm going to send my child to a bilingual school if what is going to solve our economic problems is going to be if they learn Spanish, not if they continue to speak Nahuatl. And that is that big issue that a lot of the indigenous students, when they come to the university or to the schools, they feel that they should not talk in the inter-indigenous language within the education institution. There is a very nice article that Inge, that works in the Prohíba Andes, wrote that is called "Y se le soltó la lengua." So one day he decided to break this terrible historical past that this person was carrying. And one day he decided he was going to speak his and then that was his transformation. And that is a lot of what these indigenous students that go to the Prohíba Andes talk about, how they were finally empowered to become who they want to be, rather to present themselves as assimilated and speakers of Spanish. So I would read this article that Sylvia wrote, Sylvia Schmerkens wrote here. It's very interesting because it talks about what is happening to the indigenous students when they finish in the public universities in Mexico, that they come out speaking their language. And we think, in our own perspective, that they go to the university like to continue their education. And that's also what Ivania, my student, found when she had this question of her dissertation was, why indigenous students finish high school in Oaxaca? And Ivania always thought that they went to school to finish high school in Oaxaca because they were going to go to the university. But for them, to finish the high school was a way to strengthen their communities. So to have a more educated person within their communities that can help the community to negotiate with the outside world and to write. So they were not thinking, I'm going to go to the university, but I'm going to go back and have an education that serves to link my community with the outside world. And that was a very interesting finding. And it's the same thing that Sylvia found interviewing the students that finished the university, that they really want to be able to be bilingual and strengthen how the economic capability of their communities by able to have better translation with the outside world.
Do the community get together and pool resources to send that person to finish a high school degree in Osaka? Or is it their family, in other words? Is that
Well,
like
no,
a community?
everything that happens is community. You know, if you think about even a quinceañera, you know, one person buys the mole, the other the dress, the other, you know, everybody contributes to the family. Yeah, so I think it's an extended, very extended family.
But do students really go back to their communities? I mean, they have that good intention.
Well, I mean, I think that we are going to have to do a lot more follow-up work, but the research that they are doing in the Universidad Intercultural Veracruzana is that they are going back to the community and improve what is happening in the communities. So.
Another thing.
Yeah, but we can talk more about that. But the idea is that they're really able to provide education to the children in their native language. That, as we know, that improves their cognitive and academic work in their second language. And so I think it's going to be a struggle. I don't think it's going to be something that is going to be solved. But in the other hand, we talk only of language, but then I think it's so important to say how much direct investment is happening in improving the schools where the indigenous children go. You know, because you can give them cash transfer so they go to school more and they finish more, but if the schools haven't changed, you know, the quality of the education they will be receiving is going to be the same.
So you said that Garcia was sort of a problem for the Germans. They said, all right, he's obviously not committed to this. What's the Ollanta Humala doing right now? Has he made any progress on indigenous education or not really?
Well, what Ollanta did right away is to reverse some of the decisions that affected the institutos pedagógicos where the indigenous. Basically, what happened is that in order, they passed a law in Peru that was called Nota 14.
Oh, I think I read that, yeah.
Yeah, that meant that the students, when they finish in the indigenous students, in order to go to the normal schools, had to get 7 or more, like 14 over 20. So that was 14 over that. So since they were coming from very low quality schools, when they passed the exams, they could not have that grade. So in a sense, what they did is the schools where the Germans were doing cooperation with the people in Peru, suddenly they didn't have any more students because none of them passed. And so, but at the same time, it stopped the process of decentralization. So the two things were connected: to empower the communities to take decisions about their school, that was the decentralization. And the second is to remove the students that were going to the institutos pedagógicos, so there were no more students. And that was exactly where the project was taking place. Germany is still helping in Peru in a lot of ways, but they haven't come back in education. After 30 years, I talked to the person in charge of teacher education in the ministry, and he said that the quality of teachers in Peru had improved tremendously thanks to the sustained investment that they had received from Germany. And it was really tragic that this sustained investment had stopped. There was no way to get funds from anywhere. And he said that a lot of people in Peru, including Alara Garcia, never recognized how dependent the improvement of the educational system was outside funding. And the indigenous people also said that, you know, the improvement they saw in their schools was because of this outside investment. Was this investment finished, who was going to continue? So, but it's interesting that a country that is as wealthy as Peru, with all the mining resources that they have and everything, they still need investment in their schools, rather than having more of, you know, like a state approach like Mexico, that Mexico is the one that is investing in the school. So that's Brett Gustafson, that is the one that wrote one of the chapters here. I think that he talks politics in the Andes. It's very interesting because he talks about why there is not this commitment of the Peruvian government to educate its own people. And how, you know, it's very different from Bolivia to have to be so dependent on foreign aid, that to Peru to be so dependent on foreign aid. And really there is a huge distance, you know, between the Highlands and Lima. Like one of the indigenous leaders said, you know, Lima looks towards Miami and towards the Pacific Ocean, and not looking backwards, you know, to help the people. Yes.
I'm sorry, I came in late and we may have discussed this already, but do you find, based on the last point you made, do most of the young people want to emigrate to countries, especially the US?
I don't think that most people want to emigrate. I think people emigrate because of necessity.
Yes, yes, I know.
But then they go back. Like I remember when I was working in the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. I went to the Sierra in Puebla, and because a lot of the people were arriving to North Carolina were coming from there, and in fact when I went up into the communities, I found like 10 cars or 12 cars that had North Carolina license plates. But the thing that was interesting is that a lot of the traditional agriculture was not anymore, it was not able to have any more value in the global market. So they were not able to survive with the traditional way of making ends meet. So in that area, a lot of the people used to go to Mexico City to be day laborers as workers, and then they found out that they can go a little farther and go to North Carolina and make more money. I think in the case of Mexico, that's different from Peru and Bolivia. What really changed the dynamic was the World Trade Center. Once the attack on the World Trade Center took effect, the American government decided to close the U.S.-Mexican border. So going from Mexico to the United States became much more complicated. And what happened is that a lot of people decided to stay in this country or in Mexico. So what we used to call circular migration, you know, people would come here during the warm months and work for some period of time and go back to their communities. that had stopped, so people would have to migrate in a more permanent basis, just because crossing the border has become such difficult, very, very difficult to cross the border if you don't have documents. So in one year to another, you see a tremendous increase in the number of children of Mexican origin in U.S. schools. And people were saying, where were the children? Why we haven't seen them? Well, they were in their communities, but they brought them back here to be with their parents. So there was a tremendous growth of children. But the migration pattern was totally changed when the border was closed, because it had been a very porous border for many, many years.
It's interesting because now that they're talking about globalization, which is really neo-globalization, they're saying a world of open borders and opportunities.
No, that is not.
But in fact, the borders are closing.
They are.
In reality. So you would say that it's basically maybe for economic and educational reasons why people emigrate, why they leave their countries, basically.
I don't know. I think it's not economic. I think it's to survive. I think, in a lot of towns in Mexico, in Puebla, for example, where there is such an important migration here, now there are only children and grandparents, because the people that are working age are working here, and sometimes they send the children back, but because they cannot make ends meet.